is a leading expert in the area of experimental high-energy physics. In recognition of his contribution, his students, co-authors, colleagues will present recent research related to topics that he has investigated during his distinguished research career. Professor Paic was born in Paris in 1937, but his family moved to Croatia when he was very young. In Croatia, he completed all his studies and obtained degrees in engineering and physics in 1960 and 1962, and his PhD in physics in 1964, all of them in the University of Zagreb. From that time until 1995, he was a member of the most prestigious research institute in Croatia, the Ruder Bošković Institute. From 1994 to 1997, he was a guest lecturer at the Subatec laboratory at Nantes. Subsequently, from 1997 to 2002, worked as associated researcher at CERN. In 2003, Professor Paic joined the Institute of Nuclear Science of the UNAM, and from this new house has continued his collaboration with CERN, forming a good number of students and creating the laboratory of detectors of the ICN. In 2003, a new challenge was presented at the invitation of Professors Alejandro Ayala and Juan Carlos de Olivo of the Institute of Nuclear Science of UNAM, along with the help of the director of that time, Professor Octavio Castaños, to create a group and a laboratory of experimental physics in high energy at the ICN. In the ICN, there was a tradition rich in theory, but not one in experimental physics of high energies. Thus, in April of 2003, Guy began his challenge with an empty room and without any students. But he quickly got used to the usual academic practices in Mexico and began the development of the laboratory and the construction of the instrumentation of the Acorde detector. Thus, in less than a year, he was able to build a group of young engineers and physicists who produced the ALICE data acquisition electronics of Acorde and also the detector control system, the user interaction, and various proposals for the new technology projects between UNAM and CERN. Also, Professor Paic was involved in the design of the ALICE B0 detector that was in charge of the Mexican group. In the design, he participated with the following areas: increasing the number of wave-running fibers, demonstrating that the design of the photomultipliers outside the ALICE magnet was not correct, and calculating the required resolution using simulations together with Dr. Eleazar Cuautle of the ICN. It should be remembered that this detector is the true heart of the ALICE experiment and a key piece of the experiment. The laboratory of detectors under his responsibility also participate in the design and construction of the front-end electronics of the detector Batata, at a telescope for the detection of muons designed to the experiment Auger in Argentina, an experiment led by Professor Gustavo Medina Tanco. From 2004, he analyzed the possibility of constructing a detector for the identification of particles of high momentum, higher than 15 GeVs, since the theories assume a new effects at these moments. For 4 years, he was responsible for the project that resulted in 2002 with a letter of intent. Today, he is part of the team that wrote the technical design report for the time projection camera, TPC, and the laboratory is involved in the monitoring of gas electron multipliers. Lately, in the lab was built a kit for high schools that allows to measure the cosmic rays and their characteristics. Well, Paic have made a lot of things, okay? Well, also his work with in phenomenology, for example, have several papers that have a lot of citations, okay? Some are produced with his students and collaborators from here, from UNAM, okay? And for example, the paper of the chromodynamic quantum Hasptia, proton-proton color recognition and flow-like patterns in proton-proton collisions. In 2003, have around 89 citations. This article has created a surprise in the scientific community of the area, since it was shown that the phenomenon of color recognition produces effects similar to flow. The effect is not created by hydrodynamic processes as the flow phenomena are explained. It is a novel conjecture that received a lot of interest, and the other articles point to a novel way of analyzing the CERN-RON2, okay? Well, in his training of human resources, Gies has had 4 postdoctoral students, produced 2 doctoral theses, 6 master's degrees, and 3 undergraduate degrees. All of them have been completed. In addition, has done an important job on publishing his activities, frequently giving interviews and dissemination conference. This was worth receiving in 2010 the Hushman Silver Award awarded by the University of Tabasco. In short, Professor Paic has created Ex Nihilo, a group of young Mexicans involved in the mere frontier of science, with a well-defined originality and recognizable character in the international and in the national community. His scientific and organizational and pedagogical qualities have undoubtedly changed the landscape of high-energy experimental physics and the Institute of Nuclear Science and beyond. His efforts in building parallel detectors and his persistent pursuit of the most important questions in heavy-ion physics undoubtedly deserve this tribute. Guy, continue to enjoy your birthday and continue the wisdom.
Thanks a lot, David. Now let me talk to you a bit about the program that we have prepared today. We will start with a special session where we have invited Alan Paic and Daniel Ferenc. In particular, Daniel Ferenc will give us part of the story of Guy in which he decided to move from low-energy physics experiment to high-energy physics experiment, particularly the heavy ion collisions. Then we will focus the discussion to the topic of ultra-relativistic heavy ion collisions, where we have invited many people. We will have Constantin Loisit. We will have also Alejandro Ayala and Jürgen Chukraf. And then we will concentrate in the discussion of the new phenomena that we have discovered in the small system. And for this topic, Andreas Morsch, Carlos Pajares and myself will give some presentation trying to cover the work that we have done in collaboration with Paic. Finally, to close the symposium, we will cover the topics which intend to discuss his contribution in R&D for high-energy physics experiment. Let me tell you that due to the features of this symposium, no time for questions and comments has been reserved. I would encourage all of you to discuss during the coffee break, lunch and dinner. And also, as many of you know, tomorrow we will start a workshop in Puebla where we will have enough time for discussing the topics, no, which could be important for us. So, our hope is that you enjoy the party that we have prepared for you with our affection. So, I think that it's time to start the symposium, and for this I leave the microphone to Irais Bautista, who will be the chair of the first section. Thanks a lot.
Welcome, Professor. Let's welcome Professor Daniel Frenet from University of California, and he will talk about if you think science is a pain, you are going to rock.
Thank you for the invitation. This is a great pleasure and honor for me to be here at this anniversary. I decided not to show any transparencies in my talk because we are basically talking here about a person and personal relationships, emotions, some strange events or nice events, and transparencies don't fit into this this kind of discussion. I hope my talk will not be too long. There are so many things that we can talk about. We have to leave some of them for the next 2 or 3 occasions, right? So, who am I? I'm Guy's former PhD student, and as Dr. Vergara mentioned in his talk, Guy has arrived to CERN in the middle of his career. So, basically, we arrived together. We started working together in low energy physics. We had a paper which was my first low energy physics paper, and I think it was Guy's last. We went to CERN together, and he was my PhD father. At the same time, he was my very close personal friend, and he was effectively my brother. We went through many things together as equals, and I think you have experienced the same thing here in this university. I can see that from everything that that happened after he arrived. So Guy is a remarkable person, and I had a very quick positive chemistry with him in Zagreb in Croatia. We liked each other right away, and we worked as a team, I think, very effectively for a long period of time. It is somehow very hard to explain things like love, emotions, explain artwork rationally. And this is, it's a big challenge for me to actually continue with any kind of rational explanation of positive things that come with GI, but I will just try. So one of the things why I could say that we were effectively brothers is that we had a common father. So who is the common father? The common father is GI's real father, Mladen Paic, who was born in 1905 and who lived with his family in Paris and returned to Zagreb, as Dr. Vergara mentioned. The circumstances of that return are, as far as I learned, are extremely dramatic. So at some point, Guy told me, when the war started and they were in Paris, he was totally upset with the behavior of the community. Why? Because his family was not 100% Aryan, and they were hunted like animals. They fled Paris. They were hiding in the countryside, and I remember when we were returning from one of our many trips to the Les Arcs conference, the Morion conference from Geneva. We went together with a car, and Guy told me, you see here, we lived right here. That was, I think, in Chambéry. And Guy told me we escaped from who knows where, and we felt safe here in Chambéry. And one morning, my mother, Valeria Paic, said, we have to move, we have to move. I have a bad feeling. And they did move. The next day something bad happened. I don't really remember anymore whether it was a bombardment or just Germans came in and raided the place. So effectively, his mother saved the family just out of some kind of intuition. And they kept running around away from the hunters. So they survived. After that survival and after the war was over, Mladen Paic, already in his late 40s, returns with his family on bikes to Croatia, which was at that time Yugoslavia. There was a great sense of happiness after the liberation, and Yugoslavia was a multi-ethnic, multicultural country like no other. A great deal of optimism, enthusiasm, and it was clear that it was a very nice playground for intelligent people who want to share their knowledge with others. So Mladen Paic arrived with his family to Zagreb, and he participated in the formation of the Ruđer Bošković Institute. It was created on a hill over Zagreb out of nothing. So what was there, what was created in the Institute? A cyclotron very soon, and a neutron generator. So that neutron generator that Mladen Paic created with his own hands with the help of enthusiastic young students played a fantastic role in the development of the Institute and the scientific culture. And I used it to make my master thesis, and my first paper in low energy physics and Guy's last paper in low energy physics. So that the very same neutron generator was used many, many years later for that. But in the meantime, generations of people have actually published extremely interesting work using that neutron generator. Mladen Paic then went to form another institute just a little bit down the same hill, which belongs to the university, where he was a professor and where he created a very rigorous experimental physics program out of nothing. So now he created an institute out of the second institute out of nothing, which was a solid state physics institute with a very strong program. It exists still today, and it's very strong with helium facility and many other facilities. So I was a beneficiary of all these things, although I actually never had Mladen Paic as a professor because he retired before I became a student. I was a great beneficiary. I was not aware of that. Even only later on I realized who was behind all of these things. But there was a palpable atmosphere and attitude of creating things in spite of all the difficulties. There was some optimism and some incredible drive. And there was a very clear idea that you can't really do science without creating the infrastructure for that science, without creating detectors, basically as the prerequisite to even start doing any science. So Mladen Paic was such a creator, a generous person who actually was very somehow not a frontman who was seeking TV publicity or something, but he was just working and working. And Guy is the same kind of person, and I have to say I became the same kind of person myself to some extent. And that's our brotherhood, which was somehow which made the chemistry. There were also other people who were not such brothers. Actually, most of other people there were somehow short-time shooters. They had different ideas. So when I finished my paper, actually before I even wrote that paper with Guy about beryllium-neutron interactions, I was actually a student of another student of Mladen Paic, Branka Antolkovic, who was working with nuclear emulsions still. That was a very good experience for me, and that was my diploma thesis. And I was defending my diploma thesis when Guy suddenly entered the room, listened for about 10 minutes, and then left. And I was thinking, what's going on? Later on, he invited me, and we immediately made chemistry, and we even shared his office, which was very unusual. Above his desk in the office, there was a sticker that said something like, if you think something is pain in some other place, then you are doing it wrong. That's how I titled this talk, slightly modified. I would be arrested right away if I had a sticker in California, because we have a very decent president, right? So I will be arrested right away. So, but this sticker we left many times, because there were so many occasions in our life when the life became very difficult and somehow painful, then we would say, no, this is not, we are doing something wrong. It should not be painful. If it's painful, you are doing it wrong. So think about what you are doing. It shouldn't be painful. After we finished this paper in low energy physics, there was a clear idea that we have to go to CERN, and there was a guy with the name Ivo Derrado in Max Planck Institute in Munich, who actually somehow managed to make a deal with a missing person, Reinhard Stock, who should have been here, but his wife is unfortunately sick, and who was the spokesman of a newly created Na-35 experiment. So we became members of that experiment. We had very little knowledge, both of us, about high energy physics, about experimental particle physics. We went together with Guy's car to CERN. I remember like now, we arrived there, we didn't know where to go, where to sleep. However, very quickly, we realized how to do the thing. So we had a streamer chamber still in that experiment, which was a very nice instrument, and we had no idea how it works. We tried to understand quickly, and we were together all the time, and we were working 24 hours a day to catch up with the rest of the crowd. Everybody knew something. There was a grumpy Polish guy, Marek Gazdzicki, who was like, why did you come here? We know everything, you don't know anything. Very soon we became the greatest friends with him. So we were basically, we were using scanning tables at CERN, where people, trained people would actually measure, or at the very beginning we were just counting tracks in the streamer chamber pictures that were projecting on the table. At that point, you know, we didn't know anything about the streamer chambers, so Guy and I, we would spend nights and nights scanning ourselves. So we worked as scanners, and some people on the side would look like, I mean, you are scientists, you are not scanners, because the scanners were technicians who were paid to do this job. Why are you doing this? They know their job, they should do it for you. Why are you scanning? And we were doing it together, looking at streamers, counting streamers, trying to understand, this is in the delta electron, this is not the real track, the density is like this, the density. So we were working exactly in the way it should be done. We were trying to understand the source of our data, the detector. And this kind of attitude persisted always, you know, in all other kinds of challenges that we had. We were always working, go to the fundamentals, to the basics, understand everything, and then derive your conclusions based on that. Don't behave like a professor who is sitting somewhere on some other floor, and another guy is a student and another guy is a technician, with a total disconnect between these levels. But this is one team, one unit, one project. Everybody is together in this. That's the attitude, that's the important thing. And that's somehow something that we inherited from Guy's father, and from this entire atmosphere in Zagreb. I'm extremely happy to see that Guy is actually progressing in the same way here and making the same kind of connection with people on all levels, and this is some a really great thing. Needless to say, we succeeded at CERN with our attitude and a lot of work. We succeeded very well, and very soon we were also in two special projects where we kind of split a little bit. So Guy was in one of the meetings of NA35 collaboration. The question arose, who wants to do ring imaging Cherenkov technique? And Guy looked at me like, what do you think? I said, of course. And then he raised his hand, we will do it. And so we were the first the first to raise the hand, and he's still there. There was RD26 project that led to all this solid photocathode business and high momentum PID, HMPID, and VHMPID, and many more things around. Other people are using this technology. At the same time, I shifted. I worked. I created in Zagreb, of course, with total help and total belief. Guy's belief that I am able to do it. There was never a question, maybe you are not, maybe the other guys are smarter. In Frankfurt, in Munich, in Berkeley, maybe they are smarter, maybe you cannot beat them. So we built kind of semi-automatic scanning machines for streamer chamber pictures, and we beat the others. We were able to really go into those dense regions thanks to all the ideas that were collected while we were looking into the streamer chamber events ourselves and not delegating that task to some technician. So that's very important to mention. So we succeeded there, and very soon we were in kind of a closed circle around Jürgen Schukraft and the others who were planning the next experiment, Alice, and we were designing the experiment somehow using our knowledge, which developed from our measurements, theoretical knowledge and experimental knowledge that came from all these measurements in Zagreb about palm correlations and other things, which was for a while my specialty. So we contributed quite strongly together again to this Alice effort already in 1989. Probably we were in Aachen in this first meeting, giving a talk, a presentation about correlation business, and this is how things evolved. And then after being in Nantes, and which was not maybe such a happy episode for Guy, but still useful, I went into another direction, which is gamma ray astronomy, and now I'm totally into, I even left that field after forming it. So I formed a group in Croatia that combines Ruđer Bošković, Split, Rijeka, and now even Osijek, but I kind of went out of it, which participates in gamma ray astronomy. I have another mission, which is photosensors, of large area photosensors that cost not too much for example, for ice cube extension and things like that. And Guy is here, so we are far away from, not so far actually geographically, even almost in the same time zone, but we are not so close, which sometimes really hurts. It can change, maybe. Okay, so that's my little contribution. One thing I should also mention on top of this, although I am over time, So Guy's father is always mentioned, Mladen Paic did this, Mladen Paic did that. But first of all, he wouldn't stay alive without Valeria Paic. So there was always Valeria Paic next to him, always. And she was kind of keeping his vertical, as far as I know, from all the stories. She was giving pace to their life. When I worked with Guy so intensively, there was Arlette Paic, who was an incredibly nice person. We spent enormous amount of time together as friends, and many dinners and things like that. So that was just a fantastic experience. So we have to remember her as well. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Daniel, for such a nice talk. So now we have a talk by Alan Paic, and he will talk about open access to data for science, technology, and innovation.
Hello, thank you very much for having me here. And yes, I will start also with a few personal words for my father, and then continue to talk about my present work. So I would start to say, and what Daniel mentioned very much jives with what I have to say. Daniel was his student. I'm his son, and I would say that perhaps the most important, I learned many things from my father, and but perhaps I want to tell you about three things which I think are the most important for also my career, what I learned from my father. I think the first one which I learned is you know, he made me think. It was always, since I was a very small boy, it was always, Alan, think. And it was about thinking straight, about not taking things for granted, about going beyond the obvious, about things as trivial as, you know, checking whether the number which was given by your calculator makes sense or not with your common sense, and going into more difficult problems where my father always told me to think a little bit out of the box, and maybe to use some parallels from some other parallel disciplines to understand better the problem I'm trying to solve. So I think this kind of creative thinking is something I really owe my father. Second is, thank you. Second, which I learned is, you know, to be ambitious, to really don't be afraid, and you know, try always to swim with the best, and try to be competitive with the best, and do your best. And if you fail, it doesn't matter. You will get up again. And so this is another big learning from my father. Third big learning was also, and this jives very much with what Daniel said, is you know, there's a French proverb which says, "You're never served better than by yourself." So whatever you can do yourself, and you can you know, rely on your own forces to do, try to do it yourself. And this it was a very nice illustration which Daniel gave when they were working, and I can remember that period when they were working on these streamers. And actually, as an anecdote, these streamers, I was a young physics student at that point, and I was not directly working on them, but I was fascinated by just the way this looked and how beautiful it is, and it's actually on the poster for today's event, and these streamers from the streamer chamber, and I actually took this and I had it engraved into some crystal plates, and so actually I found it really visually very appealing, and today we have a sculpture, a big block of crystal with these tracks from the streamer chamber engraved there. In addition to all that, as you probably all know, my father is quite a visionary. Now, in my case, you know, I can tell you an anecdote. When I was 17 and we were talking about my professional future, and you know, you heard about Mladen Paic, who was my grandfather, and you know about Guy, who is my father, and you know, somehow naturally I wanted to study physics, and my father actually discouraged me from that. He said, look, physics is not you know, it's not an easy way professionally, and I would prefer that you study electrical engineering. Electrical engineering is a much safer, professionally safer job. You will get a safe and good job with that, and actually he himself started with electrical engineering and switched to physics later, and Mladen Paic, who was the grandfather, he started with chemistry and switched to physics later. And I said, no, I want to do physics. This is the only thing I'm interested in. And then he was a big visionary, because he said, yeah, you know, well, okay, so you're going to be the first one in the family who is going straight into physics, and maybe you will be the first one who will actually leave physics. And that was that was actually what did happen. But you know, I learned very much in physics. So I went for my PhD at CERN. I worked in a different experiment, not in heavy ions. I worked in the structure functions. I worked on deep inelastic muon scattering, and looking at the so-called EMC effect, and that's what I did my PhD on. And then I did a postdoc, also partly on neutrino physics. And after that, I switched, and I went for a completely different career. I went into the private sector. I worked as a strategy consultant for large companies, so to understand how businesses work, and it was a very enriching experience working in different industries, from pharmaceutical to mining to refrigeration to pharmaceuticals and banking and so on. And now, since the last 8 years, I switched again, and now I'm working in policy. So this is something I want to tell you about today, is my current work in science and technology policy at the OECD. Just maybe to say a few words about the OECD, for those who, usually people know the brand, but don't really know exactly what the OECD does. So the OECD is an Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development with headquarters in Paris. It's an international organization with 35 member countries, and many more countries who work as partners, and an international organization which you could say is quite similar to CERN, but in a different field, and the motto is better policies for better lives. So basically what we do is we benchmark and we compare policies in different countries, and we try to see which are the policies which work, which don't work, and what can countries learn from each other in this respect. And so I work in this organization with a committee which is specifically focusing on science and technology policy. The organization has 36 different committees going, ranging everything from health, labor policy, investment, tax policy, etc. Basically, all the activities you have in a government except defense. We don't touch defense. Defense is in NATO, okay? But all the other parts of public policy are actually examined at the OECD. So the problem I want to tell you about today is a specific topic I'm working on right now, and I think which is quite interesting also to you as the scientific community, which is concerning open access to data, so-called open data, which is which is a very, very important topic today. And basically, of course, I'm sure this is not a surprise to you, that data usage growth all over the world is growing exponentially, and it's doubling every 2 years. And it is expected to reach 40 zettabytes in 2020, and the zettabyte is 1 trillion gigabytes, okay? So. The economic impact is also very, very large, and the potential aggregate impact of this, of the public sector information in general is estimated at 1.1% of GDP right now, and then it will certainly also grow over time. Now, what do we do about that at the OECD? Here you have a list of some instruments. So this is the way the OECD works. We examine the policies, we look at what works, what does not work, and then we issue some kind of recommendations. Okay, and these recommendations have to be consensual, they have to be signed by the 35 member states, so it means all the governments agree on these recommendations. And we have already 5 recommendations in this area, and these recommendations depend on different committees. The one you see in bold here, the 2006 recommendation concerning access to research data from public funding is in particular the recommendation I'm focusing on. So this is a recommendation which was published in 2006, and which gave a certain number of principles which have to be followed to make the data from public research available to and open to all scientists and whoever wants to use it. I mean, the rationale is quite clear. If it is public money, if it's taxpayers' money which is spent in public research to create some data, this data should also be available to the public, unless of course there is a good reason, and we will talk about that, you know, the reason of privacy protection and so on. But unless there is a good reason to close that data, it should be open. There are some other recommendations. As early as 1980, actually, there was a recommendation about this issue of data privacy, and this recommendation has been renewed in 2013. There is also a more general recommendation for enhanced access and more effective use of public sector information. There are 2 more specific recommendations which are in very specific topics. One is the 2009 recommendation on human biobanks and genetic research databases, and then there is another one about health data governance. Now, in parallel, of course, there are other people out there working on the same issue, and you have other international initiatives which include recommendations and policies by the European Commission, of course. Then there is something which is gaining importance over the last years. These are the so-called FAIR principles. FAIR means findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reuse. And this is something which came out, this is a kind of a community-based movement which started with an international conference and then became a kind of many people, actually it's a kind of a non-governmental organization where many people contributed in saying what should be the important principles for open data. Then you have the International Open Data Charter, which is concerning more generally the government information. Then you have science clouds, which are being established in Europe, Australia, the United States, and even Africa. You have a non-governmental organization, which is the Research Data Alliance, which is developing different standards. You have the Amsterdam Call for Open Science, and then you have this very recent policy by the European Commission just last year, which is called Open Innovation, Open Science, and Open to the World. So you see there's quite a lot of things happening in this space. Now, here I'm showing some results. This is a survey we did recently with our member states. I did a questionnaire, and it was answered by 28 countries from the 35 member states. And we asked them about this recommendation, which was from 2006, 11 years old, and we're thinking about now maybe renewing this recommendation or maybe doing a new recommendation. So we asked them, what is the degree of influence this recommendation had? And you can see that over time it has become more and more known. So you have, for more recent initiatives, people say it's quite important or highly important for about 40% of the cases. Now, we asked also people to tell us what are the main challenges going forward, okay? And I would want to tell you something more about these challenges. And you see here, there are 6 main challenges. The first one is about balancing between benefits of sharing against privacy and confidentiality. This is what I already mentioned. The principle is that data should be open by default, except when there are issues about potential privacy issues and confidentiality issues. And there is a balance to strike because it's usually not a black and white situation. So governments have to be quite good at that. Another aspect is about discoverability, findability, machine readability, and data standards. Here, the idea is that sometimes the data are available, but if they're available as PDF files, it's not very useful because you cannot actually reuse that data, and so this is something to be worked on. A third part is about recognition and reward system for data authors, and this is especially true in science. Okay, what happens in science is that scientists are rewarded and evaluated on the publications, not on the data they publish. So you have to publish papers, right? To get forward in science, you have to have published papers, but you don't get an additional incentive to actually, in addition to a paper, to publish then your data set, right? And that's a big barrier. Then we have the issue of responsibility and ownership. We'll go a little bit more in detail in that. Business model for open data provision, usually the costs of because it's nice to say it's a principle, yes, it's a principle, we want all data to be openly available, okay, but who pays? Okay, and usually it's, it's costly in infrastructure, it's costly in the researcher time, the researcher who has to clean up the data and who has to put it online and so on. So, and if it's open data, now there's also the question whether open data necessarily means free data. This is also a nuance, okay? Because the question is who is going to pay for the cost of providing that data. And then, last but not least, you have the building of human capital and institutional capabilities at the public agencies to manage, create, curate, and reuse the data. Now, a little bit more detail for each of these things. I mentioned the balancing between benefits of sharing against privacy and confidentiality. If you take personal data, okay, for instance, medical records. Medical records, of course, are at the same time, scientifically very rewarding. You can learn a lot of things. The medical researchers can learn a lot of things, how to cure cancer and so on by studying medical records. But at the same time, it's very sensitive, right? None of us wants that somebody can trace back to us that we had disease A or B or C. Okay, so it's one of these issues which is very sensitive, and then you say, yes, we will anonymize. We will just provide the anonymized data records, right? But then you have also people who are clever enough who can, backward engineer, especially if you get into very detailed things. If you have, many information about that anonymous individual, but you can triangulate those many different informations, and basically if you're ill-intentioned, you could in principle come back and say, okay, this was Mr. So-and-so or Mrs. So-and-so. So this is very important. You have also the so-called text and data mining techniques. If you take all the things which you have in social media, okay, if you take Facebook accounts where people publish and so on, and if you're able to do so-called text and data mining to correlate some terms, some syntax and so on, looking for some keywords, you can do very interesting research, whether it is sociology, we heard now, influence on political elections or things like that, okay? But again, concerns about privacy, okay? I don't want somebody, if I put some data on Facebook, some news on Facebook, and I want to share it with my friends, I don't want that, some foreign organism which is going to analyze that data comes back to that and says, Alan Paic had this and that political opinion shared on his Facebook account. So again, very sensitive issues, big potential benefit for science, but also big concerns about privacy. In our recommendation from 2006, we had privacy which was included under a principle for legal conformity, but probably, public concern about privacy has risen, so probably now this has to be much more enhanced. As I mentioned, anonymization techniques can be reversed, okay, so ingenious people can come back to the individual, and this has to be taken into account. The European Commission has now adopted General Data Protection Regulation, which will enter in force in spring of 2018, and this is a set of rules which is meant to protect the consumer and the individual with more regulatory protection. But then there are some concerns that this more protection will mean less accessibility for science. So there's always this kind of issues with this balance. And what is often said is that, for instance, regulations in the U.S. are much more liberal because the U.S. are looking to actually help their champions, who are the data champions, Facebook, Google, and so on, and have perhaps less issues with the protection of the individuals, while Europe has more, is more protecting the individual and the consumer, and but at the same time, then it's stopping such big companies to emerge, such as the U.S. has. So the idea is that you really have to develop a strategy for engaging with the community and to build trust. The idea is really to build trust, and there's serious issues about trust. Now, second issue was about discoverability, findability. Very often people do not know what information exists, and the lack of adoption of international standards also for data documentation, the metadata, how do you use the data? It's not just enough to dump the data on a website and expect people be able to reuse it. You have to explain what the data is, how to use the data, and so on. There's the Research Data Alliance, which was initiated in 2013, and which there are Europeans, there are US, there's Australian, and now there's, I think, 47 organizations in this alliance. And they are developing those data standards. They address a broad range of issues related to interoperability, data citation, data catalogs, and workflows for research data publishing. And in our survey, people said, they're doing good work, but very often people who are in charge of data management are not aware of this. So we need to create more catalogs, okay? We need to create single windows when researchers are looking for some data. Very often data sets exist, but they're scattered in different websites and different institutions, okay? And it's not easy for a researcher to find the right data set. So we need more data catalogs, and this is why you have this effort of science clouds, which are being initiated in Europe, in the US, and in different parts of the world. And these are things which are now being developed. So the idea is to have a single window, okay, like in a library. When you look for publications, it's relatively widespread for publications, but not so widespread for data sets. Okay, so you're studying a specific domain of interest, and to have really this single window of entry where you will be able to find the relevant data set on the relevant server. Recognition and reward system for data authors, you have to go towards this cultural change. Usually, scientists are quite protective about their data, right? They don't like to share the data. First, it's costly for them to put the data in a presentable manner on the website. Secondly, it's a risk, it's also a risk, because if you made a mistake in your analysis and you put the data available for any other scientist to be able to analyze your data, well, they could maybe prove you that you have been wrong, or maybe that you have not come out with the relevant insights and so on. So it's also a kind of reputational risk, okay? And at the same time, the incentives are not so high. Okay, data citation is not something which is very developed. Very few authors use data citation, and they're not even very standard ways of using data citations. And nobody's measured on that, right? You're measured on citations of your papers, of your publications, but not on citations of your data sets. So these kinds of things have to be developed. Also, people are also even suggesting reward systems, so evaluating people for how much data they actually publish to be used for career progression in parallel to publications. Definition of responsibility and ownership. This is another big concern, especially where you have services and resources created, and you need even within government, okay? Even within government, sometimes the data you give the health ministry or the data you give the tax authority and so on, they're not allowed to share, okay, by law, because you're giving it to one agency, and then they're supposed to keep the confidentiality. So sometimes it even creates some issues with, because citizens are asked several times for the same data, so it creates more work, but just because this kind of legislation keeps it in different silos, okay? But when you add into that the private sector, then things become even more difficult, right? And especially, for instance, as scientists, if you're putting your publications on some publisher's website, this publisher is a private company. They're going to ask for fees to provide your publication and your data. So you could argue, where is the ownership? Is this data going to be freely available to all publishers, to all researchers, or not? Or is it becoming the ownership of the publisher who has it on their data platform? Okay, so that's very. So this is the increasing risk of privatization in quotation marks of data. If you have publicly funded research, but the results of that research then goes on privately held platforms, okay? And this also raises, of course, the issues of intellectual property over data. Who owns the data, and whose is the data, and who can actually use the data at what cost? I mentioned also the business models for open data provision. Usually, if you have a server, you put open data there. You're the providing institution, so you're a researcher at, for instance, here at UNAM. If you want to put, I don't know exactly what the policy here is for open data, but let us suppose, that a researcher wants to provide the data on an open data platform. Well, typically it would be that institution who would bear the costs of the provision of that data. And if the data is open data in the sense of free and open data, which is not necessarily always the case, but very often, or at least it's an expectation of the research community that research data should be also available for free, well, then it means that the institution who is putting the data online is bearing all the costs, but these costs have to be, of course, somehow compensated, and these business models are quite difficult. And especially then you have to also make the cost-benefit case, because in some cases, some data sets may be too costly to put on an open data platform because you have the costs which are both infrastructure costs but also curation. So basically, to putting data on a platform, it has to be curated. It has to be good quality data which can be reusable by somebody, and these curation costs can be very high. Okay? So in principle, you need to have a cost-benefit analysis, but it's not always easy because benefit is very difficult to measure, and sometimes, you know, there was an effort done by Australian Productivity Commission who tried to estimate those benefits, and actually the different estimates of benefits vary by a factor of 100, okay? So depending on how you try to estimate the benefit, it can vary from 1 to 100, the dollar amount or the euro amount. So it is very difficult. Just to give you a glimpse, this is some of the work done by some colleagues in the OECD who are looking at the different business models, you know, from pure structural funding of the databases over to more, you know, subscription or use fees, which are on the bottom. So more you go towards the bottom, more you're making the users basically pay for the data. And the first half of the table is something, you know, providing data for free to the end users. And you see here that there's the pros and the cons, and it's quite complex actually consideration to find a viable business model. I won't go through this detail because it's too long. And last but not least, you know, what is important for open data is building the human capital and institutional capabilities to manage, create, curate, and reuse the data, okay? You have the issues with researchers. Researchers are, you know, usually very good at doing research, but they're not necessarily very good at data management, okay? Data management is a new skill which they have to learn, which means that they have to plan in their work plan, you know, the data management, so that the end result of their work is not just a publication which gives the result of the analysis of the data, but is also a nicely curated data set which is ready to be provided on a website, which is then ready also to be used by some other researchers who did not collect that data. And this is a new skill they have to learn. Users themselves don't always have the skills necessary to use that data in a right way. You don't necessarily have, you know, a good data literacy and good statistical skills and so on. So there's also a risk of misinterpretation by the users if the users do not have the right skills. And last but not least, you know, the technical staff in the repositories, in the platforms need training on data standards to be able to curate the data, and so they need better statistical skills, they need computer science skills, information science skills, and many countries report limitation of the current curricula in addressing those skills needs. So that is more or less the stage at which we're in. We identified some of these challenges, and now we're going forward, and we're going to try to come up with a new recommendation to update the existing OECD instruments and to see how we can contribute to the OECD motto, which is better policies for better lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Paic. So now we have 15 minutes for coffee break.
When is that?
Y que aprovechen que hay experiencia. Grazie.
the better part of the last quarter of a century. You all know, of course, that the LHC experiments are very big. You see here the Atlas one in front of the Building 40. You know that they are very heavy. The magnet of Alice is about as heavy as the Eiffel Tower at Paris. And they actually took a long, long time to build. That's my CERN identity card when I started Alice, and that was some 20 years later. Now, how long that really takes really becomes evident if we look at generation of collider experiment. This here is sort of the mother of all collider experiments, UA1. It took 1 year to design, it took 3 years to construct, then came the W, the Z, the Nobel Prize, and after 13 years the whole experiment was done and over. If we go to the next generation, that's the lab experiment, taken here the example of Delphi for personal reasons. It took already a bit longer, in particular the construction took about 5 years, but also Delphi was over after about 19 years from the very beginning to the end of data taking. And compare that to the typical LHC experiment, it took already 20 years essentially before we could start data taking. And as you see here, the period which expanded most is actually the R&D, and I will come back to that later. So, of course, nothing comes out of vacuum, so also Alice has a prehistory, and the prehistory starts in the mid-80s when the LHC, the Large Hadron Collider, was first discussed. And a few years later, 2 years later already, was the start of heavy ion physics. Last year we had the 30th anniversary of our field. And the first mention of LHC as a collider of large hadrons, the large hadrons being here led. So it was not only a large hadron collider, but also a collider of large hadrons. Happened already 1 year after in a workshop which happened close to CERN in La Pluie, where you can find at the entry of the proceedings the mentioning that the LHC is also capable actually to collide heavy ions, and but the physics potential has not been considered. Not too surprisingly, that was just 1 year after we had the very first heavy ion collisions. I think it was actually Carlo Rubbia who pushed that in and really started the discussion about heavy ions at the LHC. 1990 then was the year when RHIC was approved, the relativistic heavy ion collider at Brookhaven. There was a call for letters of intent. And so it was time to really decide for the heavy ion community whether we just would all go to RHIC or whether we also would consider making experiments in Europe at the LHC. And the first ideas were developed in a workshop sponsored by CERN overall about the physics of the LHC. And the conclusions on the heavy ion chapter on the theory that was by Helmut Satz is that indeed the collider is the best tool to study heavy ion physics, and the LHC is unique. Okay, that probably is a simple conclusion. A more tricky one was from the experiment, the convener was Specht, that actually you could build a detector for the LHC. So this sounded all positive. So 4 weeks after this workshop was finished, we actually had the very first meeting of what later would become Alice. I don't call this the birth of Alice, but I would think it's the conception of Alice. We started modest with some 60 people. We were optimistic. Actually, we were very optimistic. We thought we could start physics already in 1998. But as good physicists, of course, we had a plan B. And the plan B is should this time schedule slip, which stretched the construction schedule. And that's what we did for the next 20 years. We stretched the schedule. Now, this here is the attendance list of this very first conception meeting. And if it's the conception of Alice, you expect to find the founding fathers of Alice somewhere in here. And of course, we had Guy, who was already there. We had actually the spokesperson Reinhard, Specht, and Louis of the existing established fixed target experiments. We also had, oops, that was too quick. We also had Paolo, who became spokesperson about 20 years later, Lars Leistam, who became technical coordinator. Of course, Hans Gutbrot and myself were around. Chris, who became our last technical coordinator before Werner. And actually even Jose Mario Gago, who shortly after that left physics, and became the science minister of Portugal, one of the most successful science ministers of that country for many years. So you see heavy ion physics, we also had our spin-offs into politics. Then the birth of Alice obviously was about 9 to 10 months later after the conception. And that was at the end of 91 when we had the first meeting where the idea was really to establish what we called at the time proto-collaboration. It was a meeting where we already had formally invited institute representatives with the aim to establish a formal structure. And of course, Guy was there again, as we heard before, as the head of the Ruda Boskovic Institute delegation from Zagreb. So we were really enthusiastic, but we were also totally clueless. We had no idea what awaits us. Actually, the challenges of designing heavy ion experiment in 1990 was enormous for the LHC. We had just started with light ions at the SPS, sulfur ions 20 GeV. We didn't have a lead ion beam till 4 years later. So we extrapolated a factor, almost an order of magnitude in mass, and a factor of 300 in energy. So we really had no clue what we expect. It's like really you design an experiment for a linear collider at the TeV energy scale just after finishing an experiment at Adone. This was actually the first E+ E- collider in Italy, the one which just barely missed the J psi by about 100 MeV. You can imagine that at that time to decide a linear collider experiment was almost impossible, but that's what we were setting out to do. We had limited experience. The streamer chamber was mentioned a few times. That was what was state of the art at the time. And we had no previous example of a general purpose detector for heavy ion physics. We only had special purpose experiments, and so there was a significant challenge, both on the detector side, but also conceptually and sociologically, to actually get all these different groups, these different people, and these different characters in particular, working together on a single experiment. Not to speak about money and people. At the time there were about 500 people involved in heavy ion physics. About one half of them, 250, spent a very small fraction of their time on Alice. We had ongoing data analysis of the light ion program. We were building the second generation experiments with the TPC, NA49. RIG was approved. Some of the people also went to RIG. There was actually very little left for LHC preparation. Nonetheless, we were young, at least I was young, he was always young. We started, and the first step was the expression of interest that was called for only 1 year later, where we had 3 ideas to modify a lab experiment that did not turn out to be possible, to see whether we could do something in PP experiment. That was done at the example of the CMS, and that seemed possible at the time. Actually, that has become a very successful part of the LHC program, much more successful than we thought possible at the time. And of course, the dedicated heavy ion detector, which later became Alice. I show you here the 2 most important transparencies I showed in Evian. The first one was the number of institutes which were nominally participating. And that showed that there is a sizable community behind the heavy ion experiment at the LHC. That was very important because people just couldn't judge whether this is a one-man show or whether there's really a community behind which actually can bring the resources to build a state-of-the-art experiment. And the last transparency I showed was sort of a wild guess of how expensive the experiment would be. So my guess was at 99% confidence level that it would cost less than 395 million. Notice the currency, we still had French francs at the time. So I was not off by more than a factor of 2, but anyway, it showed that it can be possibly built with enough people and it will not be too expensive. That actually showed the early designs of Alice. You don't recognize anything because it's just built out of combination of an ISAR experiment and a fixed target experiment at the FPS. At Evian we had already something which roughly resembles the later Alice, but of course you see that's a very, very conceptual stage. Now the next step was the letter of intent. That was 1993, and that also for the first time shows the name of Alice, a large ion collider experiment. So we had the conception, we had the birth, and then a year later we had the christening of our experiment. That actually are pictures from the time he operating as usual the hardware. He is operating the copier to make the first copy. That is during the night before we finished it. Paolo is doing proofreading, and Federico is cheering. That is still what he does today. He's now the spokesman today. So these were the pictures before, and then at 8 a.m., so deadlines have to be strictly kept. The deadline was 1st of March, so at 8 a.m. of 1st of March, our letter of intent was finished, and so we could celebrate with some Alice champagne. So there is actually a champagne in France which is called Alice, and with the Alice letter of intent. Next step then was many years of detector R&D. I showed you before already at the overview that we really had a lot of time to fill, and one way we filled it is really doing detector R&D. Really trying to find new detectors to make use of this very long time. And luckily also that was very well organized by CERN. There was money, there were committees which were looking after it. So the detector R&D was organized like a physics program with collaborations. RT26 was mentioned before. So Alice had a lot of these various R&Ds in many areas, tracking the TPC, particle identification, all the way to DAC computing. Some of them succeeded, relatively straightforward. They were evolutionary advances of technologies. Some of them didn't succeed, and you see that the number of casualties was particularly high in the PID area, because there we had a problem to find a large area particle identification method which was affordable and performing, and that was very difficult, as actually Daniel mentioned already. But we had also a few big successes, amongst them the ridge detectors, which were already mentioned by Guy Work. Electronics was advanced, and also pixel detectors, for example. And some of them even made it to RIG even before we used them in Alice. Now, the next step was a technical proposal, and that is the first time that Mexico appeared formally in Alice with a group from CINVEST staff led by Gerardo. And then, based on this technical proposal, Alice was approved exactly 20 years ago. The technical proposal was not everything. We had to make many addenda because we were asked to add an immune spectrometer, electromagnetic calorimeter, transition radiation detector. So actually upgrades in Alice happened continuously since the moment we proposed actually the first rudimentary detector. And then came the technical reports. Actually, we were kept busy not only by R&D but also by committees. So the amount of paperwork for LHC was equally impressive. Coming back again to the 3 experiments I mentioned before, that is the UA1 proposal. All of 154 people were signing it. You had lots of space left on the first page. It was submitted in January of '78, and it was approved 6 months later. And as I said, the experiment was built within about 2 or 3 years. At the time of Delphi, it has grown already to about 500 pages. You see here the pile of Delphi proposals. They had one letter of intent, a technical proposal, and 7 agenda. And that is the amount of paper we had to produce in Alice, almost 5,000 pages. And I didn't dare to put the Atlas and CMS pile above, but that would have probably gone beyond the scale of this photo here. So we were kept really busy by paperwork. But we also progressed in the design of the detector. You see here various Alice designs. The LOI detector already looking very much like the final design, actually having quite a few more calorimeters than we have today. Even in the forward direction, we are still trying to make a forward electromagnetic calorimeter. We had already one in the LOI. There was a time of a mega Alice where we had 2 muon arms, one on the left, one on the right. Actually, I've been in the National Museum for Anthropology, and it does remind me a little bit to some of the Inca statues with their big ears at the side. Anyway, that did not go very far because that was really not affordable. So at the time of the technical proposal, we had really settled on 1 million arm. Note that we did not yet include any support structures, cable and services, which then really for the next 10 years we had to struggle with because we had to find a place for them. And that's finally the experiment as it was in around 2003, with most of the detectors already in, but for example the V0 from Mexico was still no, it's already here actually. Okay, also the collaboration grew significantly over that time scale. You see here the number of people in the ALICE collaboration, starting with around 250 at the LOI, grew linearly in time. By the last technical proposal, no, by the time of the first memorandum of understanding, the formal agreement between funding agencies to fund the experiment, we had breached the 1,000 barrier. But it actually, if you look today, it continued. ALICE today has nominally somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 members. I'm sure that here must be, that's on the grey book, that must include people who never show up. I don't think we have 3,000. But still, if you use this scale here, it actually has continuously grown over time, and somehow we must exhaust by now the available number of people working in nuclear physics. But it seems to be growing. That actually shows a photo of the ALICE technical board around the time we had reached 2,000 people. You see here we had already quite a sizable number of Mexican colleagues in our technical board, and one soon-to-be Mexican colleague, because I think at that moment we were still CERN in 2002. Okay, the next step then was construction, installation, and commissioning, which took about almost 10 years from the very first modification of the ALICE experiment till the very first beam. I show you some photos from the very beginning when we removed the L3 experiment. You see that was quite dirty business because some of the structures were so big we couldn't take them out in one go, so we had to cut it into little pieces. And then the experiment magnet was cleaned, and it was completely empty in 2001. And for the next 6 years, we spent actually filling it till you see here, essentially the experiment shortly before we finally closed the front doors to take the first data. Okay, fast forward to the startup of the LHC, which was meant to be in 2008. We actually did have one event in 2008. Not obvious because there were no colliding beams, so it must have been a beam halo interactions with one of the with the beam pipes, but we did see tracks in our inner tracking system. Then of course came the Big Bang, the magnet accident, not the Big Bang we were hoping for, but something which gave us another year of testing the TPC with cosmic rays. So that physics started then only in 2009. And these are pictures from the very first collisions in 2009. Just before the first things happening, everybody is concentrated, looking forward. This is about 3:30 in the ALICE control room. We wait for collisions. And then indeed, that is one of the very first events popping up at the ALICE control room. So this time it was interactions. And of course, this was time for happiness, jubilation, and some celebration. Now, after so many years looking at Monte Carlo data, one of our youngest students, Jan Fiete, he had prepared some analysis. And actually, while we were off having champagne, he collected a few of us and actually showed us a few hours after the first data taking, the first online multiplicity distribution. And indeed, this first multiplicity distribution 5 days later made it onto the front page of a physics particle journal. This was the very first publication of the LHC. It took 20 years to build the ALICE experiment. It took 40 minutes to take the data. We had about 250 events. It took 1 hour to get the preliminary results. It took 2 days to get the final results, so we were very busy working. Then it took 3 days to agree on the author list. So that's why it took altogether 5 days to publish the paper. We should have agreed on the author list before. Anyway, so what did we measure? So we measured how many particles are created in these collisions. Technically it's called the NDY, and it turned out to be some number. Actually, was that of any relevance? It seems so, because a few days later I read in National Geographic, no less, that a machine called Alice found that a proton-proton collision created the precise ratio of matter-antimatter particles predicted from theory. Okay, so that was surprising. So we must have overlooked something. Okay, so the first observation is, of course, there is some mythical relevance of this number. It's close to pi, but it's not exactly pi. But indeed, we had found something very profound. We discovered a strong violation of what is called Stokes' law. Unfortunately, Reinhard is not here. He would know what it is. Stokes' law states that for a heavy ion experiment using TPC, the number of tracks per event is equivalent to the number of authors per publication in the first publication. So this was discovered accidentally by NA35. It was then confirmed by NA49 and even by Starr. And obviously this was badly broken at LHC, because the number of tracks divided the number of authors was a very, very small number. It should have been order 1, but it was order a few per mil. So that was badly broken. Actually, it turns out that the statistical error is dominated by the data, and the systematic error is dominated by the author list. We never knew exactly how many authors we have on any given publication. Actually, we made a second discovery that has not been known so far, and we discovered that time travel is possible. Because we actually made the first publication 7 days before the first scheduled collisions. Okay, so it was fun, and of course it was fun because many, many people contributed to this experiment, and finally the physics exploitation has started, and one, of course, of our preeminent founding fathers was very instrumental in doing that. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks a lot to Jürgen. So there's only 5 questions, so you have to ask him later if you have questions. So now we go on to Professor Günther Roland from MIT, who is one of the spokespersons of S-Phoenix, and he will tell us exactly about the future plans at RIG about S-Phoenix.
Okay, ready when you are?
Seems like the file is just a narrow file.
Huh. It works for me. I'm not. As I said, I can download the file and it works just fine, but from the Indigo page. Do you just want to hook up my computer? It might be fastest.
Okay, so this is for the control.
Okay, let's get started. It's a great pleasure to be here. My second visit to Mexico after the meeting we had for a similar occasion 5 years ago. And so let's jump right in. I'll, in the end of my talk, present plans of the S-Phoenix collaboration for building a new experiment at RIC, starting data taking in about 5 years from now. But first I want to start by describing a little bit of the journey that took me personally from my beginnings as a graduate student at CERN almost 30 years ago to where we are now with our plans for the future. So this you have seen a number of times already, an NE35 streamer chamber picture. I was a graduate student at Frankfurt with Reinhard Stock when I started working on heavy ion physics in 1989. And this is a picture of the S-Phoenix experiment that we are planning to build for sort of the next decade. And I'll talk a little bit about the journey that got me from here to there. And one of the things that happened over the 30 years that lie between these two pictures is that the understanding of what it is that we're actually looking for has evolved by quite a bit. When Reinhard was trying to convince me or to join his group as a graduate student, well, that's not quite the correct story, but when I was thinking about joining Reinhard's story, I mean, the story that he was, Reinhard's group, the story that he was telling us was about what we were going to do was that we were going to discover the nature of the phase transition between the normal nuclear matter and the quark-gluon plasma, which might be a first-order phase transition, at which point we would see all sorts of exciting things that happen as matter crosses this phase transition, fluctuations, bubbles, undercooled, overheated things, very exciting. Of course, shortly thereafter, it turned out that this is not a first-order transition at all. It is a crossover, and therefore you shouldn't expect a lot of these things to happen. But, well, what did I know at the time? And I will use this later to tell a little bit more about this journey. What is interesting, of course, that there was this journey for me from here to there, and in parallel over the same 3 decades, there was this journey from for Guy from NE35 to where he is now. And as I mentioned, there were quite a number of intersections of our path on over the last 3 decades, and I mentioned a few of those in the talk. The first one, of course, was in NE35. This picture was taken a couple of years before I joined. And within sort of a month of me joining Reinhard's group at Frankfurt, I was shipped to CERN. Of course, I had previously done some work in semiconductor physics, so I knew nothing. And therefore, they told me that to be useful at CERN, I should work with Guy, who was working on the rich detector that Daniel already mentioned. And so I tried to do some work there, mostly to do with software, but also with trying to help with the shifts necessary for running that instrument. And that was quite interesting. So this is a picture of the NE35 experiment with the magnet here and then some calorimetry over there. This is another view of this particular drawing of this particular area. Here's the counting house where most people would spend the night shifts trying to take data. But there was then one small contingent of people, or maybe 1 or 2 guys per night, who were sitting sort of here on the ground, right next to the magnet, next to the control system for the rich detector, which, if I remember correctly, well, that was certainly a very complex device. At that time, rich detectors were really not mainstream, but still in sort of exploratory stage of what could be done with them. And this was a particular design with, if I remember correctly, a liquid radiator and a photosensitive gas with some tummy admixture where you had to be there was a very small operating window between the boiling temperature of the liquid radiator and the temperature at which the tummy additive to the gas would condense and destroy all your detector. And so one of us had to sit next to the magnet in what felt like a very close range to the beam. I'm not quite sure that that would pass safety inspection today, and make sure that the whole thing survived the night. So that was sort of one of my earliest memories of what I did as a grad student at CERN. So as I said, this was a very challenging device. And the one thing that I remember, and I think I only realized in thinking about this talk, that this is really something that was an incredibly valuable lesson for me, was that we had daily meetings, and we had lots to talk about daily meetings for the rich. And Guy, of course, was always there in the middle of it and in the trenches with everybody trying to make the best out of that device. And which is, I mean, it's a particular style of working. There's another style of working that Franz also mentioned, with the professor sitting in an office and everybody else trying to sort of implement orders far away from that. And that definitely was not Guy's style, and I think this was also a style that on occasion I really tried to adopt in the work that I did with my students. For example, in the startup of the Phobos experiment, we were all sitting in the same, in the counting house or in the same office and trying to get something done with the data. And I think that was really a very important lesson in a very challenging environment. Okay, and of course NA35, I mean has this really fantastic streamer chamber pictures, and we really went from sort of what Reinhard had sold me on to what the NA35 and the field as overall did over the last over the following 10 years or so, to establish that we really created the conditions under which we could enter this quark-gluon plasma phase. And from there, I mean, after sort of having convinced us that we were able to enter this new state of matter, the question then, of course, I mean, became, what are the properties of this state of matter? What is the initial structure, the initial thermodynamic conditions? What are the transport coefficients that characterize how this matter behaves? And that, in essence, was the sort of goal of the field over the 10 years after the initial stage of the SPS program and in the beginning of the RIG program. After they established that the existence of the quark-gluon plasma, then the goal became to understand its properties in a quantitative manner. And in addition to this, is additional hope to find actually remnants of a first-order phase transition as you go along on this μB axis, but I'm not going to talk about that. So if you try to summarize what happened on this program to understand the properties of the quark-gluon plasma in a few slides, I think one of the key successes, and I think the major success of the field, and what really allows us to not conclude our program in say, 5-6 years ago, but to really keep going, is the fact that we could indeed through a series of experimental and theoretical advancements, understand at least one of the properties of the quark-gluon plasma, and it turned out a really important one quantitatively, and that is the ratio of the shear viscosity to the entropy density, which governs sort of the long wavelength, long distance behavior of the plasma, and which shows that the material that we're making in these collisions is has really a unique place among all the known materials in the universe in terms of its fluidity, which is far better than that of any other known substance. And furthermore, we found that sort of the underlying strong coupling that enables this behavior is something that the quark-gluon plasma shares with many other interesting states of matter. Some exist only in theory, in string theory. Others exist in ultra-cold atoms or in strongly correlated electron systems. So this is really a material that has unique properties that we can measure, and connections to many other fields of physics. I think that's really what drives the continued interest in this field. There's sort of one little fly in the ointment, and that is something that we'll also discuss in the later session today. And this is sort of the second intersection that I had with Guy, and in this case Antonio, where I remember that there was a quad matter in Annecy in 2011, which was sort of the first big conference after CMS had announced that we had seen this possible indications of this fluid-like behavior, not just in heavy ion collisions, but also in PP collisions, if we looked at collisions with very high multiplicity. On these correlation plots, that doesn't look particularly spectacular. There are these huge features here that are just due to the presence of jets, which are seen in low multiplicity collisions and also in high multiplicity collisions. But then there's this little blip here, which is a correlation that extends over a large range in pseudo-rapidity in angle between the two particles, and shows that two particles are preferentially emitted in sort of the same direction, perpendicular to the beam pipe. And so this is, as I said, if you don't know what you're looking for, this doesn't look like a very spectacular effect, but in essence this is a hint of the same liquid, this can be interpreted as a hint of the same liquid-like behavior in proton-proton collisions that was previously only seen in heavy ion collisions. And we'll hear more about that later, and this search for QGP-like effects in PP collisions is certainly something that has occupied both Guy's and my work for quite a few years. This is then the same effect in proton-lead collisions, another small system, but here the effect is really pronounced, just as it is in heavy ion collisions. But there's a whole session on that, so I won't spend a lot of time. And move to the other QGP property that we have really understood much better over the last decade. And here there was a seminal paper published by Guy and two young students at the time, Andrea and Konstantin. Konstantin is here, so he will probably tell you all about this. But this paper really marked the beginning of a systematic study of parton energy loss in the quark-gluon plasma by many groups and many experiments, leading to a few years ago the first sort of systematically controlled determination of another transport coefficient of the quark-gluon plasma. This one is called Q hat. It sort of tells you how much a parton is kicked around per unit length as it traverses the quark-gluon plasma. And this is sort of the second major property of the quark-gluon plasma that we've managed to extract quantitatively. Okay. So if I look at the questions here, so this one turned out to be not quite the right question for most of the transitions, most of the events that we were studying. We certainly have established that we can enter this new realm of matter, and we have extracted a number of properties of the quark-gluon plasma quantitatively. So we have over 30 years made enormous progress both in refining the question that we think is actually interesting and then finding answers for that particular question. So now where do we go next? And over the last years many people have thought about that very carefully, and then it becomes obvious that while we sort of now understand, have measured the properties of the quark-gluon plasma, we do not understand yet how these properties actually arise from the underlying interaction, quantum chromodynamics, which at very short distance scales or very high momentum scales is just an interaction of point-like particles with each other. How do we get from there to a state of matter that at long wavelengths looks like a near perfect liquid? That's the question that we have to answer now. How do these properties that we have measured actually emerge from the underlying microscopic structure of the material? How can we characterize this microscopic structure? And that is, for example, the goal that in the 2015 long-range plan, the nuclear science community in the US has set for themselves, to probe the inner workings of quark-gluon plasma by resolving its properties at shorter and shorter length scales. And for that, it's essential to have both the LHC, ALICE, and CMS Atlas, and now also LHCb, and to have a new state-of-the-art jet detector at RIC called S-Phoenix. And that's what I'm going to talk about in the rest of the talk. Do you know how much time? 15 minutes, that's plenty, excellent. Okay, so let's talk about S-Phoenix. What does S-Phoenix want to do? Well, as we said, and the task is clear, we want to probe the inner workings of the quark-gluon plasma. How do we do that? Well, we do what nuclear physicists and particle physicists have done for the last century or so. We shoot stuff at matter, and then we look at how the stuff gets scattered, and we deduce from that what the structure of the matter is. So with that recipe, you can find that atoms consist of nuclei, that nuclei consist of nucleons, and that nucleons have quarks in them. And now we want to see what happens if we shoot stuff at the quark-gluon plasma, and while the nature of the probe that we have here is such that we can probe the region in between this long wavelength liquid that we've seen and the point-like interaction of point-like quarks and gluons that we know has to exist sort of in an asymptotic limit. Is there something interesting happening at intermediate length or momentum scales? The only difficulty here that doesn't make this quite fit into this succession is that the quark-gluon plasma, of course, only lives 10 to the minus 22 seconds, so we can't shoot an external probe at it, so we have to use probes that are auto-generated in the collision process of two nuclei itself. And there are sort of three classic examples of those that S-Phoenix is planning to employ to study the quark-gluon plasma as a function of, say, momentum or length scale. One is to use jets and jet structure. I mean, every jet essentially starts out in a point-like scattering process, but then evolves into something that has that spans both angular and length scales and momentum scales. And we can see if there's modifications of the structure of the jet when it propagates or when it evolves in the quark-gluon plasma compared to an evolution in the vacuum, and can try to see if we can link certain modifications in angular or momentum scale to certain structures in the quark-gluon plasma. Maybe the conceptually easiest way to probe the plasma at different length scales is to just take bound states of different size, have them evolve in the plasma and see which ones are affected, which ones are not affected, and to which extent. And that's what one can do with spectroscopy of the Upsilon family. And we can vary a different scale by looking at how partons of different mass or flavor propagate through the quark-gluon plasma, starting from gluons, which are by themselves massless, very light quarks, heavy quarks like charmed quarks, and really heavy quarks like B quarks, and see how these different quarks of different mass, partons of different mass affected differently as they propagate through the plasma. So we want to have a detector that can do all of these things very well. And if you then translate what you want to be able to do and what the detector has to be able to achieve in terms of precision, statistics, differentiation between different particle types, we arrived at a design that is shown here. And the detector that is called S-Phoenix for historical reasons. I'm not sure if I want to go into that. Actually, no, I do want to go into that. The state that we are in now, 2017, is a result of 7 years of development. So the origins of the S-Phoenix concept were as an update or essentially a replacement of the Phoenix detector in response to a challenge in 2010 to develop a plan for the next decade. Phoenix essentially said, we have almost, or we will, in a few years, we will have done what we can do with the existing design. We want to replace it with something completely new that does something that does not exist at RIC, and that is to detect jets with full calorimetry and in a large acceptance state-of-the-art detector. So that was sort of the motivation for Phoenix to develop the S-Phoenix concept, which proceeded over a number of years and then also had a huge influence on the long-range plan that I mentioned before, the US nuclear physics long-range plan and the hot QCD part in that. Then there were proposals submitted to DOE some number of years ago, a review, updated proposals, more reviews. And then 2 years ago, almost exactly 2 years ago, the collaboration, the science collaboration was formed in the first collaboration meeting. Shortly after that collaboration meeting, I, to my great surprise, found myself co-spokesperson of SPhoenix, to my surprise, because I had really nothing to do with all of these things that happened in the 5 years prior, other than working on related physics at the LHC. But well, we together with Dave Morrison from Brookhaven, we started sort of trying to organize the collaboration. We received sort of a mission need agreement from DOE about a year ago, submitted more proposals, went through many more reviews, and are hoping for a CD1 review in the first half of 2018, which will really set the project on the way to construction. Okay, so what is it that these people want to construct? Let me just remind you, as you saw for Alice in Jürgen's talk, the collaboration starts with a few motivated people and then hopefully grows. And here is a list of the 64 institutions that are in SPhoenix right now. And the ones in black here are institutions that just joined over the last months or the last year and a bit. So this is a growing collaboration. At the moment there's about 230 people on our collaboration list. I think this has to grow by maybe 50% or so, maybe a factor of 2 to really have the workforce that is needed to build and operate and analyze this apparatus. Just a picture of lots of happy SPhoenix collaborators. And let me say a few words about the detector. So like Alice, we actually have built this detector around a reused magnet. In our case, it's a 1.4 Tesla superconducting solenoid from BUAP. And then the overall layout is, of course, a fairly typical collider detector with a tracker on the inside and electromagnetic and hadronic calorimetry on the outside. In some senses, sort of a mix of concepts from Alice and Atlas/CMS. Atlas and CMS, of course, we have full electromagnetic and hadronic calorimetry in 2 pi over about 1.1 plus minus 1.1 units in pseudo rapidity. And then in Alice, with a very strong magnetic field. But when you look at the tracking system, this actually took a lot of inspiration from Alice with a continuous readout TPC, a silicon strip intermediate tracker, and then a 3-layer microvertex tracker that is actually an exact copy of the Alice ITPC ITS in a tracker, innermost detector. So this is a picture of the BUAP magnet that has arrived at Brookhaven actually almost 2 years ago, had last year a successful low field test under superconducting conditions, obviously, and will in the next weeks or maybe the next couple of months have a full field test at 1.4 Tesla at Brookhaven. This took a little bit because you have to build a flux return around the magnet to do the full field test, but that's coming up shortly. This is the central tracking system. I already mentioned it, TPC, silicon strip tracker, and on the inside the MAPS-based microvertex tracker. I think for scale, one should mention that this whole apparatus fits into the empty space inside of the Alice TPC, so the outer radius here is only 78 centimeters. So it's inspired by the Alice technology. We're actually planning to use the same readout chips, the Sampa chips, but there has to be a lot of optimization that is done specifically for having such a compact device. This is sort of the layout of the inner vertex, the microvertex tracker. I don't really have to go into that because that is as close as we inner tracker. With one problem is that our beam pipe is sort of a millimeter larger in radius than the Alice beam pipe, which of course makes life annoying and somewhat expensive because we have to re-engineer some of the supports. This is the TPC, I already mentioned it a few times. Then we have the calorimeter stack, which has tungsten scintillating fiber electromagnetic calorimeter. Then an inner H-cal. This is having that inner H-cal is largely dictated by the radius of the magnet. And then the outer H-cal, both the hadronic calorimeter parts are steel scintillating tile sandwiches, which we had in the test beam, and we find that they really perform as we expect. So what in terms of the physics, let me just show a few quick slides on the physics. So in terms of jet physics, the idea is to do similar measurements to the extent possible as done at the LHC in terms of single object measurements like jet RIA, DB, meson RIA, BTEC jet RIA, with some overlap in the kinematic range between what we can reach at RIC and sort of the lower end of the LHC measurements, and of course also dijets, photon jet, double BTECs, unfortunately no C's at RIC to be had at 200 GeV collision energy. Then we will do upsilon physics. This is the projected upsilon signal in PP collisions with very, very good momentum resolution, a combination of high precision tracking and a very strong magnetic field and relatively low mass. And then we also believe that using the MAPS-based microvortex tracker, we will be able to fully reconstruct B mesons. So this is sort of one of the golden channels for mass-dependent measurements. This is a timeline. Actually, this is not a slide that we made, but it's from a talk that Tim Holman gave at last year's RIC users meeting, with the start of physics somewhere in 22 calendar year, or maybe 23 fiscal year, and then with say 4 or 5 run periods before we have to transition to the electron-ion collider. And I mean, that should give us enough time to collect about 260 billion or so lead events within our good vertex range, a little bit more than what Alice, CMS, and Atlas want to collect over the next decade, and then really have complementary measurements at RIC and at LHC. The key challenge that we're facing right now is, of course, in addition to building the experiment, is to really figuring out how to answer these questions. This is, I think, not just for S-Phoenix, but of course, maybe as a construction project, we have to pay the most attention to that. We really have to come up with a crisp answer to the question of how we can actually achieve these goals. This is, in a sense, $1 billion question. I mean, S-Phoenix doesn't cost $1 billion, it costs, depending on accounting, maybe 100 million. A lot of it for labor, some of it for existing facilities. But running both RIC and the LHC for 5 years or for a decade, this, then I mean, you're starting to talk about real money. And understanding the emergence and inner workings of a strongly coupled system from an asymptotically weakly coupled gauge theory is the right question, but what we have to figure out over the next years is to how to really answer that question. If, for example, you think about jet measurements, currently there's a lot of emphasis to understanding how the parton shower evolves in sort of a medium that is essentially static color centers. So it's not an interesting medium, but we're starting to understand how the jet shower actually evolves in that medium. Obviously, these studies do not give us really a handle on to understand how we can learn something novel about the medium, because the medium in these studies isn't novel. So I think one needs to come up with a parallel approach here, where we take interesting media, interesting models of the quark-gluon plasma, containing some of the quasi-particles that we might want to discover, be it QCD monopoles or some other structure that really supports the interesting properties that we've seen, and then understand how the measurements that we have at our disposal can be used to resolve the question of what makes the quark-gluon plasma really interesting. And I think this is well, something we have to admit at the moment. We do not yet know how to answer this question. On the other hand, I think this is also what makes the field exciting. I mean, there really is something to learn there, both on the experimental side to understand what are really the observables that we have at hand, and on the theory side to see what is it really that makes the quark-gluon plasma work. And with that, I think time is out. The talk is over. I think I've tried to show how the field has evolved over the last 30 years with 3 decades of discoveries. I've shown that mine and Guy's interests have intersected many times for some of the key elements of these discoveries. And it is also true that there are profound questions that after these 3 decades still remain. And hopefully S-Phoenix will make big contributions to answering these questions. And I look forward to presenting the first S-Phoenix results at the next edition of this meeting in 5 years. Thank you. And there will be no questions. Who's next?
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. Thanks. Thanks a lot. And so now we have the final speaker of the session, which is Alejandro Ayala, here from ICN, who will give us a glimpse into the future.
Here it is, right? Has to be dragged. Future has to be dragged every once in a while. So it is my real pleasure to be here and to speak on this occasion. The title of the talk has to do with things that I've discussed with Guy in several occasions, and that I hope I can show how our plans here for at least an important part of the community working in this field in Mexico have become a priority, because it shows that his influence can also go beyond what he does currently. In other words, I'd like to speak to you about how we become interested in exploring from the theoretical and experimental point of view what happens in the QCD phase diagram in the high density domain. And so let me start by mentioning that in my interaction with Guy, I've noticed that things don't change. Well, I mean, there are some things that don't change. One of them is that I use the same black jacket. It's the same that I have had for a long time. But also that Guy likes parties quite a lot. So this is the 3rd one that I have attended as a jubilee for him. And I'm pleased that I have done so, and I really hope that I can attend many more. So this is the overview of the talk. What I want to do is to concentrate on the physics of the QCD phase diagram, and then mention some of the possible tools that we have to our disposal to try to understand this very complicated physics. I will end up by mentioning some recent results where I want to emphasize that one of the main goals of at least part of the community working in this field is to locate what is this critical endpoint if it exists. And then I'll conclude. So let me just start with the cartoon that is very popular nowadays, which shows the phase diagram, the QCD phase diagram, going from a normal world made out of hadrons to the quark-gluon plasma, and what has been achieved in the past few years, which has been one of the goals of his work. This is exploring how this hadronic matter transits from the world at low temperatures and low baryon densities to the world of high temperature, but still low baryon densities. And this is, of course, LHC real. In a even more colorful diagram, you see that there are several experimental facilities that are probing such transit, and we were just mentioned about the future plans to go still in this direction, in the temperature axis, keeping the net baryon density low. But of course, there is a lot of other experimental facilities that have been thought of, and some of them are working, in particular the best one program in STAR. And of course, there are other facilities here. Of particular importance is, at least for the Mexican community working in this area, is this NICA facility, which, well, you can all see that will explore a wider range of the phase transition, and will pay special attention on the location of this critical endpoint. What is this critical endpoint? Well, let me look at it from a less busy point of view, if I can. Oops. I may not. No, I want to switch. Yes. So maybe. Can you switch it for me?
Yeah.
Okay, next. Oh, it's a problem with the computer. The lesson to be learned is that they come whenever you least expect them. What is that again?
Somebody didn't like where you put the critical point relative.
Yeah, there you go. You should have gone
relative to fair.
There you go. There you go. Yes. Yeah, that's probably why. You can use my computer if you want.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. I hope it won't freeze again, because the critical endpoint is more or less in the same place where it was before. But the point in this less busy plot is that of particular importance to part of this community is to locate whether or not this point here, which marks the end of a phase-order phase transition line, and the onset of a crossover transition, as has been already proven and explored by some current experiments and lattice QCD, really exists, and where it exists. So let me just walk you through some of the properties of these phase transitions, as we know, and from general considerations, we know that close to the temperature axis, the vertical axis, for barium densities close to 0, the phase transition is not really a phase transition, it's an analytic crossover. There are no divergences in thermodynamic quantities, no symmetries to break. It would be a real phase transition for massless quarks. So we know that. We also know that there are a series of arguments that are very compelling to say that at t equals 0, this is a first order phase transition. So the question is, if the first order phase transition exists close to the horizontal axis, and then it turns into a crossover phase transition, then is there a critical endpoint or not? All right, so our tools come from, at least from the theory side, come from the results of lattice QCD. And so here, let me show you some old results from this collaboration here, which shows you how the light quark condensate behaves as a function of temperature. And so you see, if you compute what it's called the susceptibility, you see that there is a peak on such a quantity somewhere here, and the results can be summarized in this slide. So the critical temperature that is deduced for 0 baryon chemical potential happens at around 170 to 150 MeVs, so to speak, depending on different ways of computing it. Of course, since this is not a real phase transition, the results for the critical temperature depend on the way you measure. So it's not surprising that you have this spread in results, but still the message is that there is a crossover phase transition somewhere around 150, 60 MeVs for 2+1 light flavors. But that's about it. So we know all of those things right around here, but this is terra incognita. So what is the way to explore it? At least what is the way to have a theoretical handle on the properties of matter under those conditions? Well, see, lattice QCD works very well for for 0 baryon density, but what is the problem if we try to explore with lattice QCD deeper into the phase diagram? And the problem is the sign problem. See, when you do lattice simulations, you're required to compute the fermion determinant. And the fermion determinant at finite density has this contribution right here. And so the question is, let's see what we can deduce if we take mu to be complex. If we take the identity, this identity right here, and then we compute the determinant, we see that the determinant is not real unless mu is equal to 0 or purely imaginary. So in other words, for real values of mu, you cannot do so easily Monte Carlo samplings. And the problems seem not to be that bad, since we could always think or remember that that a complex number is made out of a real number times a phase. So if you wanted to compute the thermal average of any observable, say O, then you use this identity and you can replace the average that you want to compute by this formula right here. And so you see, the point is, well, okay, do your samplings with the real number, which is this determinant of absolute value, and then life should be all right. See, but the point is that if you want to do that, you can do your sampling with the phase quenched theory, so to speak. You take away the phase. And then what emerges is that the average value of this phase, it is really a function of the volume that you're working with and the difference between free energies in one and the other phases. So you see that if this number is put in right here in the denominator, close to the phase transition, this thing is going to explode. It's going to be just impossible to get the noise under control. And this is called the severe sign problem. So lattice QCD cannot do this kind of samplings without having a very noisy background. But what lattice QCD can do is to move a little bit away from the vertical axis, and this is done in using several techniques. So if you take the ratio of the critical temperature for finite mu, when mu is close to 0, to the critical temperature when mu is equal to 0, mu b is equal to 0, then you can do, for instance, a Taylor expansion, and then if you don't go far away in this series, you can compute the value of the curvature, this number right here. And there are several groups that have done such work. So you see that this is the kappa, that curvature. And these are the numbers that you can get. So you can see that these numbers, this is a dimensionless quantity. These numbers are quite small. So the transition curve close to the t-axis is pretty much flat. And these are this is a summary of results. You can see here that you can parameterize the transition curve with such values of the curvature right here. And you can put on top of that some other calculations. For instance, the hadron resonance gas model right here. This is either the blue or the continuous line right here. And you can also put on top some experimental results. These are these red points. And what you can see is that you can more or less, at least for ratios of mu b to t less than 3, the experimental results follow pretty much the transition curve, which is predicted on the basis of assuming thermodynamical equilibrium in the hadron resonance gas models. So one can think, well, okay, we are mapping with the experimental results, the transition line, but as you can, all of you know, this is different physics. In other words, the transition that we're talking about are real QCD transitions. In other words, we are talking about either the restoration of a symmetry or deconfinement, whereas the hadron resonance gas model, what is doing is just telling us how phase space is being occupied when we assume that particles are in thermal equilibrium. So this is different physics, and it's a mystery in the deepest sense why this coincidence exists. Let me come back a little bit to lattice results, because one could think that one should push how lattice computations are done. And see, indeed, this happens, and in the last years, well, this is a technique that has been tried to be implemented from a long time, but only during the last years has been really successful. This is the analytic continuation from imaginary values of the chemical potential to real values. So what lattice computations do is to take samples of their averages with some discrete values of the chemical potential in the imaginary part, and then they extend that to the real values. The noise is large, of course, and the results have a lot of uncertainty, but they can at least put some constraints, and one of the most important ones, either with that technique or with the Taylor expansion, is that the critical endpoint does not exist for ratios of mu b to t less than 2. So in other words, if it exists, it's deeper into the phase diagram, and this this result has been discussed during the last years repeatedly. Now, another thing that you can look from here, from this table, is from this plot, is that theoretical efforts to locate the critical endpoint give very wide locations, very wide possible locations. So, in other words, things are not really under control. What I just said can be better pictured in this plot here, which is coming from this reference right here. And these are the limits that the Taylor expansion technique puts on the critical endpoint. So you can see that for the temperature ranges that could be probed, see this is for instance close to the temperature axis in the QCD phase diagram. The critical endpoint temperature should be, sorry, the critical endpoint, the baryon chemical potential to temperature ratio should be larger than, say, 4. But if the temperature is smaller, then it should be at least larger than 2. So this is the excluded region. The critical endpoint doesn't exist in that area. So what we can do is to try to come up with some tools from my point of view. One of those tools should be, well, they can be analytical in the sense that it is easier to grasp, to get a little bit more understanding from analytical tools and then to try to go and look into the regions that these analytical tools tell you that something is going on rather than just doing a blind sampling. So let me just describe to you one of these analytical tools. One of them is an effective model of QCD at low energies, and this is one possibility, the linear sigma model with quarks. You may remember that the symmetry behind this Lagrangian is the chiral symmetry. So this is SU2 cross SU2 symmetric. And the way to implement chiral symmetry breaking is by spontaneously allowing spontaneous symmetry breaking here, which has some consequences. One of them is that the masses of the particles are expressed in terms of this vacuum expectation value. In this way, this A squared is the wrong sign mass term, and the masses of the fermions are given as proportional to this vacuum expectation value times the coupling between the bosons and the quarks in this model. So if you want to explore how this can describe to you phase transitions, what you do is to compute the effective potential, the energy at finite temperature and finite densities. And so let me just walk you through some of the elements that go into one of such calculations. You need to compute the first, well, you know that this is a 3-level potential, and you need to implement some vacuum stability, so to speak, conditions. So in other words, you need to renormalize this 3 potential. Adding some constants right here that you will later determine from some conditions that you can choose. And in our case, we chose the transition points at the vertical axis and the horizontal axis. And this is some technique that has been implemented in other contexts previously. So then you compute the first order correction. This is a one-loop correction. You include in your effective potential at finite temperature and density the contribution from bosons and the contribution from fermions, and you allow that these Matsubara frequencies bear the input of the densities that you're looking for. And in this case, for instance, in the fermion case, this is where the baryon density will appear. But if you want to really probe the properties of the plasma, you cannot stay at one loop level because this is like a gas approximation. You need to take into account the fact that these particles interact strongly among themselves, and therefore you need to put into the game the plasma screening effects. Plasma screening is considered through the contribution of the so-called ring diagrams, and this is the analytical expression for such contribution. It involves the boson self-energy, and of course the boson propagator, and this is how you compute it. And of course you need to compute the boson self-energies, and in order to gain analytical insight, you can either work through the horrors of this computation, or else do an approximation, and what we decided to do is to resort to low temperature and a high temperature approximation. All right, so this is the high temperature approximation. This is the whole effective potential at high temperature. This is all of the expression. It's analytical in the sense that it's an approximation that works at high temperature. The leading, all of the terms that you see here are leading terms in temperature. You can also do the same at low temperature. For that matter, we decided to introduce also the information that high baryon density can also mean high boson density. So we included the boson chemical potential in here in this calculation, and we just proceed. All right, so let me show you some of the results. This is some recent work, just recently submitted for publication. This is the archive reference. And at low temperature, what you see is that the contribution from bosons and fermions offset each other in such a way that the effective potential for low values of the vacuum expectation value, which is the order parameter of the transition, make the potential flat. This is what you expect at the second order phase transition, which here mimics the crossover transition. Whereas at high temperature, the fermion contribution is more important than the boson contribution in some sense, in the sense that at low values of the vacuum expectation value, this sum does not offset, and it produces a small barrier between two minima. This is the sure sign of a first order phase transition. So how does it look like? Well, if we carry out this calculation, we can, with our analytical approximation, map and try to find the critical endpoint. At low values of baryon chemical potential, we find that this is a second order transition. In other words, this is what in our approach mimics the crossover transition. We cannot say anything here because here temperature is not the smallest of the scales, the largest of the scales, neither the smallest. So in this green region, we just did an interpolation, but in this other region right here, we find that at very high values of quark chemical potential, which is a third of the baryon chemical potential, we find first order phase transitions that end at the critical endpoint, we locate for values on the order of 40 MeVs for temperature, and on the order of 330 MeVs for quark chemical potential. From here on, we also have second order phase transitions, and again, here we cannot say anything, we can only interpolate. Here, what we did was something that we think it's well, it's new in the field, in the sense that, as you can see, there are many parameters involved in the theory. In particular, there is this mass parameter right here. There are the couplings, of course. And what we decided to do is to try to compute them self-consistently. In other words, resorting to physical values of some of the parameters involved. In particular, for instance, the masses at zero temperature of the bosons. The sigma and the pion in particular. You see that at zero temperature, and we can make some relationship with these masses because they involve the same quantities right here. And so if we relate them and we use information from lattice QCD, which is the location of the critical temperature at zero baryon chemical potential, and the conjecture position of the point at finite density where this line ends and meets the horizontal axis, then we can set up a system of equations that allows us to solve for, in particular, the self-coupling for bosons and the coupling between bosons and fermions. And so if we vary the location of those points that I just mentioned, for instance, if we vary the critical temperature for zero chemical potential between 165 MeVs and 175 MeVs, and the conjecture endpoint positioning quark chemical potential at 0 temperature between 330 MeVs and 350 MeVs, then we can find these ranges for these couplings. So in other words, we're not just using the couplings that you naively would take from 0 temperature calculations. We rather compute them in a self-consistent manner. So we can vary some of these values. For instance, here what we did was to, oops, it doesn't show that I varied something, but there are other values with respect to that we can also find here as solutions, as possible solutions, and then there is a third possibility right here. So in other words, our approach, which tries to be analytical and wants to capture the main ingredient of this phase transition, coded in this case as the restoration of chiral symmetry. We are not paying attention to the confinement, but just chiral symmetry. From chiral symmetry arguments in an effective model, we are trying to locate this point, and in all of the cases we studied, we are finding that this critical endpoint is actually very low in this curve right here. In other words, low temperatures and high values of quark chemical potential. All right, so let me just come to my summary. And as I mentioned, one of the main goals of future experiments in this field is to study QCD at finite baryon density. I just want to mention that stress that in the Mexican community interested in this kind of physics, we are setting up efforts to try to take part in one of these experiments, in particular NICA. For those of you that will attend the QCD Challenges workshop this week, Marilena Tejeda will give a brief overview on these efforts. But from the theoretical point of view, there are many challenges to study this kind of environment. And of particular interest is to determine whether or not there is a set critical endpoint in the QCD phase diagram. And since lattice QCD is far from providing a definite answer, we need theoretical hindsight. And one of those tools to provide this hindsight are effective models. And we've used one of them, the linear sigma model, as one possibility. But of course, we need to complete the exploration. In particular, one of the possible avenues is to remember that since we went beyond mean field, couplings should also bear the baryon and temperature dependence. So this is work that we are currently doing, and we will be reporting on that soon. So for today, I just want to say happy birthday, Guy. Congratulations. It's been many years of successes, and may it be many more. Thank you.
So thanks a lot. And so now we have the break for lunch, and we reconvene at 4. Ciao.
Okay, the people who will join the